90-day fiancé. Brandon exposes Razet. He wants Mallorie's money, not her. Brandon did not accuse Razet of being confused about marriage. He did not say Razet was simply uncomfortable with a prenup, and he did not even stop at saying the two men had different ideas about trust, because what Brandon finally said was much more serious. He believes Razet wants the life attached to Mallorie more than he wants Mallorie herself, and the moment those words came out, the entire argument changed from an awkward conversation about paperwork into a question that could destroy the relationship. What makes this so explosive is that Brandon is not claiming he caught Razet with a secret bank transfer, a hidden message, or some perfect piece of evidence that instantly proves everything, because his argument is built around something much harder to dismiss and much harder to prove, which is a pattern in how Razet reacts whenever Mallorie tries to protect what she already has. According to Brandon, the problem is not that Razet has less money, and it is not that Mallorie has more, because plenty of couples enter marriage with different financial situations and still build something real together. What bothers him is that every time Mallorie talks about keeping her existing security separate, the emotional temperature suddenly rises, and that is the detail he cannot get past. Mallorie immediately pushes back because, from her point of view, Brandon is taking one painful disagreement and turning it into a character judgment. She says Razet is not asking her to hand over a suitcase full of cash. He is not demanding that she put his name on everything tomorrow morning, and he is not sitting there calculating what he gets if the marriage ends. What Razet has actually said is that he feels insulted by the idea that they would stand in front of everyone, promise to build a life together, and at the same time sign a document that seems to prepare for the day they separate. And that explanation sounds reasonable until Brandon asks one very simple question that Mallorie does not answer right away. If Razet truly does not care about the house, the savings, or anything Mallorie owned before the relationship, then why does protecting those things feel like an attack on him? That is where this story really starts, because the prenup itself is almost becoming a distraction. The real fight is about what that prenup means to each person. Mallorie sees it as a seatbelt, something she hopes she never needs, but something she would rather have before taking a huge emotional and financial risk. Razet seems to hear something completely different, because to him the document sounds less like protection and more like suspicion. He hears Mallorie saying that she loves him, but he also hears a second message underneath it, which is that part of her is already preparing for what happens if he disappoints her. Brandon, however, thinks that emotional interpretation creates a dangerous trap for Mallorie, because now she has to choose between being protected and being believed. If she keeps the boundary, Razet can say she does not trust him, but if she removes the boundary, then she proves her trust by giving up the very protection that made him uncomfortable. Brandon does not need to prove Razet is running some calculated plan for that dynamic to worry him, because from where he is sitting, the result is still the same. Mallorie becomes the person expected to take the bigger risk. At first, Mallorie refuses to let Brandon frame it that way, and she reminds him that Razet is pride, that he has his own idea of what marriage should look like, and that he may genuinely feel humiliated by being treated as though he is entering the relationship with one eye on her property. She tells Brandon that he keeps talking about what Mallorie could lose, but he is not talking about what Razet may feel he is losing, which is dignity, belonging, and the sense that his future wife sees him as family instead of someone who needs to be legally contained. For a moment, Brandon actually has to sit with that because it is a fair point, but then Mallorie reveals that she has been thinking about changing the agreement simply to stop the conflict, and that is when his whole attitude shifts. Brandon asks her what exactly she means by changing it, and Mallorie explains that maybe she has been too rigid, maybe marriage is supposed to involve taking a bigger leap, and maybe holding on to every protection is sending Razet the wrong message. She says she does not want the beginning of their marriage to feel like a negotiation, and she definitely does not want Razet walking into it believing that she expects him to fail. That sounds romantic until Brandon asks whether Mallorie actually changed her mind or whether she is changing the boundary because Razet is upset, and the difference between those two possibilities is enormous because Mallorie knows that changing a decision from confidence is not the same thing as changing it because conflict has become uncomfortable. If she has genuinely decided that the protection no longer matters to her, then that is her choice. But if she still wants the protection and is only considering giving it up because she cannot tolerate Razet being hurt or angry, then Brandon believes they have just uncovered the real problem. He tells her that compromise is supposed to leave both people feeling heard, while this compromise seems to leave Razet feeling trusted and Mallorie feeling exposed. And when he says it that way, even Mallorie stops arguing for a second. Then she asks the question that Brandon has been daring her to ask all along, which is what proof he actually has that Razet wants her money, and Brandon gives an answer that is almost more interesting than another accusation because he admits that he does not actually have proof. That answer matters because this could have become a ridiculous scene where he pretends suspicion is the same thing as evidence, but instead, he admits the uncomfortable truth. He cannot prove Razet is using Mallorie, he cannot prove Razet is thinking about her assets, and he cannot prove that the prenup fight has anything to do with greed. What he can say is that he has watched Razet become much more emotional when money and protection enter the conversation, and he thinks Mallorie is making concessions faster than Razet is. Brandon calls it a pattern, while Mallorie calls it an interpretation, and the difference between those two words becomes the entire fight because both of them are looking at the same behavior while seeing completely different motives behind it. Because look at what Brandon is actually pointing to. The first time financial boundaries come up, Razet is offended. The second time Mallorie tries to explain why those boundaries matter, the conversation becomes about trust. Then, when Mallorie starts talking about softening those boundaries, the tension seems to come down. Brandon sees that sequence and thinks the obvious question is why Razet becomes more comfortable as Mallorie becomes less protected. Mallorie sees the same sequence and comes to a completely different conclusion. She thinks Razet becomes calmer because he finally feels emotionally chosen, not because he sees financial opportunity. To her, Brandon is confusing relief with greed, and if that is what he is doing, then he is not protecting her at all. He is poisoning her view of the person she loves. That is when Brandon makes the point that really gets under her skin, because he tells her he is not worried about Razet because Razet has less, he is worried about Razet because of what appears to happen whenever Mallorie says no, and suddenly that single word becomes much more important than the money itself. Brandon says anyone can look loving when everything is going their way, but the real test of a relationship is what happens when one person sets a boundary the other person does not like. Does the partner disagree and eventually respect it, or does the disagreement keep growing until the boundary disappears? He tells Mallorie that if she wants to know whether this is about money, she should stop trying to read Razet's mind and watch what he does when the answer remains no. Mallorie hates that suggestion because it makes the relationship sound like some kind of experiment, and she does not want to test Razet like a suspect. She wants to trust the man she plans to marry. Still, there is something in Brandon's question that she cannot completely shake, because if the house truly has nothing to do with Razet's feelings for her, then keeping it protected should not change what they are building together. And just when it looks like Mallorie and Brandon are going to keep circling the same argument, Razet finds out what Brandon has been saying, which immediately changes the energy, because now the person being analyzed from a distance is standing there ready to answer for himself. Razet is no longer hearing a vague warning like, be careful, or think about the prenup. He hears that Brandon believes he may want Mallorie's money more than he wants Mallorie, and to Razet, that is not concern anymore. That is an accusation against the entire relationship. The first thing Razet wants to know is not what Brandon said word for word, because he looks directly at Mallorie and asks whether she believes him, which puts her in a position where any answer is almost guaranteed to hurt somebody. If she says yes, then she is admitting she doubts Razet's motives. If she says no, then she has to pretend Brandon's concerns did not affect her at all, which is not completely true anymore. She tries to explain that she does not believe Razet is using her, but she also thinks the financial conversation has become unhealthy, and Razet immediately hears the second half louder than the first. Razet turns to Brandon and asks what exactly he thinks he's trying to take, and Brandon refuses to turn the discussion into some dramatic list of things Razet supposedly wants, because that would make his own argument weaker. Brandon does not give him a dollar amount, because that would be absurd. Instead, he says the issue is not whether Razet has asked for a specific amount. The issue is that Mallorie is starting to believe love requires her to remove protection. Razet fires back that Brandon has no idea how insulting it feels to be treated like a financial threat before the marriage has even started, and for the first time, Brandon's theory gets a serious challenge. Razet says that if money were truly his plan, he would be much smarter about it. He would not argue. He would not get offended. He would not make the issue bigger. He would smile, agree with everything, wait until they were married, and never give Brandon a reason to suspect him. Instead, he's been open about feeling hurt, which he says should tell Mallorie that the disagreement is emotional, not strategic. And I have to admit, that is probably the strongest defense Razet could make, because people who are planning something usually try to reduce attention, while Razet is doing the exact opposite. He is making his feelings obvious, he is allowing the conflict to become visible, and he is not acting like somebody who is carefully trying to keep everyone comfortable. But Brandon does not back off because he says being angry does not answer the question, and then he asks Razet directly whether anything about his relationship with Mallorie truly changes if everything she owned before him stays protected while everything they build after marriage can belong to the life they create together. Razet pauses, and it is not some huge dramatic silence where everyone suddenly knows he has been exposed, but it is long enough to make the room uncomfortable because this is the first time the argument has been stripped down to one clean choice. Brandon is not asking whether Razet likes the prenup. He is asking whether Razet can accept Mallorie while accepting that part of her financial life stays separate. Razet eventually says the problem is the message, not the money. He says if Mallorie protects everything so aggressively that he always feels like an outsider, then yes, something changes emotionally because he does not want to enter a marriage where he is constantly reminded that her real life existed before him and he is only being allowed into part of it. That answer is much more complicated than Brandon expected, because now the fight is no longer about whether Razet wants the house. It becomes a much more uncomfortable question about what belonging should look like when one person already has far more to protect than the other. Then Razet turns the accusation back around, and suddenly Brandon is no longer the only person asking questions, because Razet wants him to explain why he was so ready to believe the worst possible version of this disagreement. He tells Brandon that maybe the reason Brandon cannot accept his explanation is because Brandon decided from the beginning that a man with less money must want something from a woman with more. He asks whether Brandon would be this suspicious if Mallorie were marrying someone with the same assets, the same background, and the same financial security. He tells him that calling every disagreement about money a red flag can become its own kind of prejudice because it assumes the person with less has to prove love in a way the person with more never does. That lands harder than Brandon wants to admit, because for the first time, he has to consider that trying to protect Mallorie and constantly treating Razet as suspicious are not necessarily the same thing, even if Brandon has convinced himself that both come from the same place. For the first time, Brandon looks less certain because he knows protectiveness can become condescension very quickly. There is a difference between warning Mallorie to protect herself and treating Razet like he is permanently auditioning for trust, and Brandon has to consider whether he crossed that line when he turned discomfort into motive. Mallorie could have ended the argument there by defending Razet completely, but instead she says something neither man expects because she admits Brandon did not create every concern she has and, in some ways, he only said out loud what she had already started quietly asking herself. Now Razet is stunned, because he thought this entire accusation came from Brandon, but Mallorie explains that the part bothering her is not whether Razet has secretly calculated what her house is worth. What bothers her is that every time she tries to explain why financial independence makes her feel safe, Razet hears it as a statement about how little she trusts him. Mallorie says she wants him to feel like her husband. She wants them to build a shared life, and she does not want money sitting in the middle of every important conversation, but she also does not understand why being married should require her to become less secure than she was before the marriage. That becomes the emotional center of the whole story, because suddenly this is not Brandon versus Razet anymore. It is Mallorie finally separating the idea of loving someone completely from the idea of surrendering every form of protection just to make that love easier to believe. Razet tells her that marriage requires vulnerability, and Mallorie agrees. But then she asks the question that makes him uncomfortable again because she wants to know where the matching vulnerability exists on his side of the relationship. She is not trying to embarrass him for having less, and she makes that very clear. She is asking what risk he is taking that requires him to trust her in the same way he is asking her to trust him. If she gives up protection over something she spent years building, what is the equivalent sacrifice he is making simply to prove that he believes in the marriage? Razet says emotional risk counts, and of course it does, but Mallorie points out that emotional risk exists for both of them. They can both get hurt. They can both be abandoned. They can both discover that marriage did not become what they hoped. The difference is that one of them is also being asked to make a financial decision that could outlast the relationship itself. Brandon gets quieter here, and that is important because this is no longer his moment to keep pushing, because he has already forced the question into the open, and if he keeps talking now, he starts becoming the problem instead of the person who exposed it. Mallorie needs to hear Razet's answer without Brandon interpreting it for her. Then Mallorie finally admits what she is actually afraid of, and it turns out losing money is not even the worst possibility in her mind, because what scares her more is wondering whether she can tell Razet no and still feel loved afterward. She says she does not want every financial boundary to become a referendum on the relationship, where Razet feels rejected and she feels guilty until somebody gives in, because once every disagreement becomes a test of love, the person who hates conflict the most will eventually become the person who gives up the most. That statement changes Razet more than Brandon's accusation ever did, because Brandon can be dismissed as an outsider who does not understand them, but Mallorie cannot be dismissed that easily. She is the person Razet says he wants to marry, and she is telling him directly that his reaction to her boundary has started making her question whether disagreement is emotionally safe. Razet tries to explain again that he never wanted the house, and Mallorie says that may be true, but wanting the house and wanting her to remove the protection are not exactly the same thing. Even if he never thinks about owning it, the pressure still matters if she feels she cannot keep it separate without hurting the relationship. For a few seconds, it looks like there is no answer that can fix this, because if Razet says the prenup still offends him, Brandon will take that as confirmation, but if Razet suddenly accepts everything, Mallorie may wonder whether he is only doing it to prove Brandon wrong. Then Razet finally says the thing Brandon has been waiting to hear, because he tells Mallorie that she should keep the house protected, and that she should also keep whatever belonged to her before him protected, if that is what she genuinely needs to feel safe. He tells her he does not want her giving those protections up simply to make him feel trusted, and for one moment Brandon has absolutely nothing useful to add, because Razet has just given the answer Brandon insisted he wanted from the beginning. Mallorie is emotional because this is the first time the discussion has not required her to choose between security and love. Razet looks relieved because he finally gets to make the point he has been trying to make from the beginning, which is that he wants Mallorie, not a legal claim to the life she built before him. If the story ended right there, Brandon would look like he completely misread the situation, but of course it does not end there because Brandon has one last question, and it is the question that keeps this from becoming an easy victory for either side. He asks Razet what changed, because if protecting the house is acceptable now, Brandon wants to understand why the same idea created so much conflict earlier, and why Mallorie had to become this uncomfortable before Razet could finally hear what she was trying to say. Razet does not dodge it this time. He says he was reacting to what he thought the document meant. In his mind, Mallorie was not simply protecting her.